So this is a short lecture about the early age of exploration. So I'm really only covering through the beginning of the 16th century. Most studies of the age of exploration begin with Columbus, but really the age of exploration gets going significantly earlier under the Portuguese prince Henry the Navigator. Now, the name is a little bit misleading. Henry himself never actually sailed on any ships. Instead, what he did was sort of bankroll a series of operations and allow different cartographers to put together the work of different explorers. Still, under his guidance, throughout the early and mid 15th century, Europeans were able to explore the coast of West Africa around the Sahara Desert and down into the region that is today Gambia, Ghana, and etc. Prior to then, it was considered to be impossible for European sailors to go south of the Sahara Desert because they wouldn't be able to get back. How were they able to do this? What was the big change? He actually wasn't really the big change. The big change was the caravel. So a caravel is kind of like a general term for a new type of ship. The caravel had a number of advantages compared to the galley, which is the previous ship that's used most frequently in the Mediterranean. What you would see is the galley is really low, whereas the caravel, the hull sits up very high, which allows it to survive in the wild Atlantic. But the big advantage that the Caravel had over its competitor ships was that it utilized what's called a lateen sail. So you see in the front, many of these sails are square shaped. However, to the back, you have two triangular sails. Those are called lateen sails. What lateen sails allowed Europeans to do for the first time is called tacking against the wind. With a series of square sails, it's all but impossible to sail into the wind. With a lateen sail, you can, because what you can do is shift it from side to side and change the angle of the sail. By doing that, you can take advantage of whether a wind is like, let's say, slightly, if you're trying to go north, slightly southeast. So what you do is you take advantage of that little bit of the wind that's going to the eastern part and you sail at a diagonal, always changing the lateen sail from side to side to take advantage of the wind that's blowing in the easterly direction. And so by sailing in that diagonal, you can tack against the wind. The caravel is what allowed Europeans to be able, for the first time, to go against the currents that hitherto had precluded them from being able to sail. Of course, Christopher Columbus is the most noteworthy of any of our early explorers. Everybody knows him. What most people don't know is that he actually made a series of 4 voyages: 1492, 93, 98, and 1502. The last voyage was a little bit bizarre. He winds up getting shipwrecked in Jamaica, getting back in a canoe, so on and so forth. It's interesting, but it's a little bit bizarre. Now, here's the thing about Christopher Columbus. He's much maligned in a lot of press nowadays. And if you don't like Christopher Columbus, I would tell you, guess what? You're in good company. A lot of people didn't like Christopher Columbus at the time that he sailed, and I mean people in Spain. Christopher Columbus was actually Genoese, so he was from what we today would call Italy. And for that reason, a lot of Spaniards did not appreciate his voyages of discovery despite what he found. After his second voyage of discovery in 1493, Christopher Columbus found himself taken back to Spain in shackles and had to explain himself to the European monarchs. To a large extent, this is because of his brutality towards the natives, which is well documented and something that we'll get into in later lectures. That being said, Christopher Columbus was, of course, the first European to launch a successful voyage across the Atlantic, other than the Vikings, and the one who opened up the New World to Europeans, even though, as I'm sure you all know, he did not think that he had landed in a new world. He thought he was in some permutation of Asia, some points thinking he was in what you would call Japan, other times thinking he was in an island off mainland China. Now, Christopher Columbus was followed up by Vasco da Gama. It's Vasco da Gama, not de Gama. Vasco da Gama follows up Bartolomeu Diaz, who had previously rounded the Cape of Good Hope. That's in southern Africa. And in 1498, he crosses the Indian Ocean and begins Portuguese expansion into today what we call India. Now, what's the value of this? The value of this is, of course, spices. What the Europeans are trying to do is get their hands on valuable spices, which are almost worth their weight in gold, even more so at this point. And this allows the Portuguese to undercut what are Mamluk efforts and what will be Ottoman efforts to constrain that trade. Now, after Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama, once it becomes apparent that, okay, there's more to this world than we thought it was, we have to decide how we're going to divide it up. And so the Pope, it's actually the Borgia Pope, Alexander VI, was a very colorful history, decides that he's going to draw a line. And that line is called the Treaty of Tordesillas. It's signed between Portugal and Spain. Everything to the east of the line will go to Spain. Everything to the west of the line is going to go to Portugal. Now, it just so happened that nobody realized how big South America was, and so they didn't realize how far they had drawn it, and that meant that Brazil was going to go to Portugal, which is why the Brazilians today speak Portuguese, and the entire rest of South and Central America speak Spanish. Clearly, this was a haughty and arrogant effort on the part of the Spanish, Portuguese, and the Pope, who himself was a Spaniard, because it cut out all the other European nations. And I don't mean to go without saying, of course, that he didn't give a lick what the indigenous peoples thought. This was followed up by Francisco Magellan, who sailed around the world. Kind of. His crew made it all the way around the world, but Magellan himself died after getting involved in a series of tribal conflicts in the Philippines, somewhat ill-advisedly, and his ship linked the rest of the way. That being said, his ship, at least, or his voyage, was the first effort, a successful effort by a European to sail around the world. The last explorer that I'll talk about is Ponce de Leon. No, he never got to the Fountain of Youth. That's what he's famous for, but he's actually really influential. He settled San Juan, what is today Puerto Rico, and was the first person to explore Florida in any sort of major way. We think that he sailed with Columbus on either the first or the second voyage. There is some mixed historical information about that, but it's certain that he was along for the ride at one point or the other. That brings us to the point of conquests. Of course, there are indigenous people who are on these different continents at the time that Europeans get there. The two main civilizations in South and Central America are the Aztecs and the Inca. Hernan Cortes first invaded what is today Mexico, which was then conquered by the Aztecs. He was pushed back, but came back in 1521, captured Tenochtitlan, and was able to subdue the Aztec people. Initially, he was reviled back in Spain for some of his efforts, but later on became a national hero. Now, I should point out that Spanish efforts to conquer these advanced civilizations in the New World were somewhat aided by the fact that European diseases decimated the indigenous populations. He was followed up by Francisco Pizzaro, who after being mayor of Panama, decided he was going to conquer the Inca. He first arrived in Peru in 1526, and by 1533 was able to capture the Inca ruler Atahualpa. And because Atahualpa was considered to be a god, it paralyzed the entire Inca system and military, allowing the Spanish to take over. Peru eventually, and Lima, Peru, becomes one of the two Spanish capitals of the New World. If you're interested in hearing a lot more detailed information about all of this, you can check out the podcast, westernciv.com. It's got a lot more information. I've got probably at least 20 hours on these explorers total.